Hello, and thank you for attending the Responsible Trade Worldwide webcast this afternoon. During today's webcast, we'll be taking an in-depth look at absence management, offering insight and guidance on how to tackle these issues in the workplace. Today's webcast will be hosted by our General Manager, Robert Purse, who has extensive experience as an HR manager. So it's at this point I'm going to hand over to Robert, who's going to talk us through how to manage absence in our organisations.
This is the first of a series of 4 webcasts. Our aim is not only to add value to your organisation through your involvement with responsible trade worldwide, but also to demonstrate how you can make a positive difference to the success of your organisation. We're going to be covering a number of issues that are covered by the Responsible Trade Worldwide tool and methodology. These include absenteeism, grievances or workplace conflicts, and staff turnover. So let's look at just what absence costs. According to CBI research, absence costs British industry £12 billion a year. Put another way, this amounts to £600 per employee per year. This figure, I have to tell you, almost certainly understates the situation and fails to properly account for a range of issues that include lost production, overtime or temporary staff costs, and diversion of managers from their day job, their proper job if you like. Historically, absence has tended to be reported in terms of percentages or days lost. In my experience, this is a lost opportunity. Expressing absence in monetary terms, pound notes for want of a better expression, has far more impact and is not actually so difficult to do. Winners and losers. If we put aside the public sector, where the figures are quite surreal, the winners are hotels, restaurants and leisure, where absenteeism runs annually at 2.3% or 5.1 days per year. Financial services sector, with an absenteeism level of 2.4%, which equates to 5.6 days per year, and telecommunications, 2.5%, which is also equivalent to 5.6 days per year. The losers are manufacturing and production, absenteeism level of 3.5%, which is equal to 8 days per year, and food, drink and tobacco at 4.6% or 10.6 days per year. Do remember though that it is not in the final analysis the percentage that counts. It is the cost to your business and the impact of that cost in terms of competitiveness. So turning now to measuring absence, there are many ways of measuring absence. A number of useful measures include the lost time rate. This is a good headline measure. Take the number of days or shifts lost to absence, divide by the total number of working days or shifts in the period, and multiply by 100. Frequency measure is a good measure of the scale of the problem. Take the number of spells of absence, divide by the number of employees, and multiply by 100. The Bradford factor. It's not perfect, but it's a very useful measure of the disruptiveness of absence that also helps identify people where there may be a problem. Bradford score is based on a formula of S times S times D. It's not as bad as it sounds, because S is the number of occasions of absence in the last 52 weeks, and D is the total number of days absence in the last 52 weeks. So how does the Bradford factor actually work? Well, let's take 3 examples. One absence of 14 days is 1 times 14, or 14 points. 7 absences of 2 days each, 7 times 14, 686 points. 14 absences of 1 day each, however, is 14 times 14 times 14, or 2,744 points. You can see now what I mean when I point out that it measures the disruptiveness of absenteeism. Whatever methodology you use, do remember that it should never be used in isolation. So let's spend a couple of minutes looking at monitoring absence. It's something of a cliche, but if something is not measured, then it will not get managed. If you do not monitor absence, then you'll have no basis for measurement or management. So when you have the data, then what next? Internal comparisons, certainly, which should help you to identify hotspots within your organisation. And external comparisons, not to show how good you are, but simply to benchmark you against industry norms so you can see whether your problem is significantly better or significantly worse than other organisations in the same industry or sector. Comparisons are important. It is useful to have an appropriate benchmark to judge your organisation against others. However, the real key is active management. Sickness absence policy and practice. Assuming that you have a policy, and you really do need a sickness absence policy, let's look at some basic principles. Your policy needs to be flexible, it needs to be fair, it needs to be consistent, appropriate, and proportionate. Properly managed, you can significantly reduce absence, particularly short-term absence, and its cost to the business. But it does need some work. So let's look at some approaches to short-term absence. Notification. Well, barring exceptional circumstances, particularly with the proliferation of mobile phones nowadays, there is no good reason why an employee should not be able to contact their line manager on or very shortly after their first day of absence. Return to work interviews. These are critical and they are not a paper exercise. Line managers need to dedicate some time to return to work interviews, and the shop floor is not the place for them. Incidentally, employers also need to make sure that their line managers are properly trained in conducting return to work interviews. Triggers for action. Look for absence patterns. Fridays, Mondays, days immediately following or preceding bank holidays, days immediately following away football matches. Just looking back at return to work interviews, these are not confrontational and they do not involve the line manager making a quasi-medical judgment. What they represent is an opportunity to discuss an absence, to identify any underlying problems, and there may be problems. People may actually be working in their spare time as a carer, and that may necessitate some occasions when they can't attend work. So identify where there are problems, and also, most importantly, agree the way forward. How can you make a difference? Big question, but here are some ideas. Employee engagement. Making your company a good place to work. Encouraging a positive work-life balance. Monitoring and managing absence, and ensuring that you have appropriate procedures in place. Do remember that your people will know who is abusing the system. They'll know who is pulling a sickie. So ignoring the issue will make it worse. It will actually encourage other people to also abuse the system. Linkage. There is an understandable tendency to view absenteeism as a standalone issue. At Responsible Trade Worldwide, we think that this is a flawed view. We believe organisations need to consider a number of issues that include absenteeism, certainly, but also grievances and labour turnover. If you're experiencing problems in 2 or more of these areas, it may be a symptom of a more deep-seated problem or problems.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for that insight. I think everyone would agree that was really very interesting. So it's at this point we're now going to give you the opportunity to put your questions to Robert. So I'm going to hand over to our colleague Tamara, who's going to run our Q&A session. Over to you, Tamara.
Thank you very much, Bex. So we've had some really great questions, so thank you very much, everybody. I think we're probably best to jump straight into them all. Robert, I know that you touched on this already, but one of the questions here we had was, how can we get the most accurate feedback when employees are returning to work? Would you recommend a return to work form or an interview, even though this does take long?
I'd actually recommend both. Which is a quick and easy answer, but yes, there should be a return to work form. Why? Because you should actually keep a record of the fact that an interview has taken place, but it should not just be a paper exercise. With the best will in the world, we can all be economical with the truth when it comes to filling out a little piece of paperwork. Much more difficult if you're sat down face to face with your line manager. And the tendency I've found, and I have conducted quite a few return to work interviews, is that people are surprisingly honest if you sit down in a non-confrontational setting and just talk about the reasons, the background and the way forward.
And someone else has asked or stated that they've got an employee who's regularly absent, and they've linked it to a pattern of absenteeism in his personal life. What could you recommend to tackle this?
I think one of the things that you need to do is to actually sit down with the individual and hopefully achieve a number of outcomes. One is to make sure they realise that this is unacceptable, that certain standards of attendance are expected, but also to clearly identify what the causal issues are. So, for example, you may get somebody who has mental health problems, in which case you need to look at it as sickness related rather than just unauthorised absence. But the key is to sit down, talk, understand what the problems are, make sure there's a shared understanding of what the possible consequences might be if there is no improvement, and agree a plan of action going forward.
Excellent. And I think we've got time probably just for one more question. So what could HR do to ensure their processes are communicated and filtered through to line management?
Well, of course, in many organisations in the industries and sectors that we're dealing with, there may be at best a very small HR department, and quite often no HR department at all. But let's assume that there is an HR department. It is not their responsibility to manage absence. Certainly they're responsible for maintaining records, or they should be, to lessen the administrative load on line managers. But they need to make sure that they're sharing that information with line managers. Otherwise you end up with an HR department, which is a huge amount of information and knows perfectly well who has the worst attendance record. Unfortunately, they don't actually tell the line managers, so nothing happens, and everybody else sees that particular individual getting away with it, so the situation gets worse rather than being managed. So the HR director, the HR department is there to support, to advise and assist. But they don't actually run, for example, the return to work interview. The return to work interview is the responsibility of the line manager.
Thank you very much, Robert. Back over to you, Bex.
Thanks, Tamara and Robert. Those questions were really interesting, and thank you to those that put them forward. So at this point, I'd like to thank you all again for your time today. But before we go, we just wanted to give you a quick recap on our upcoming webcasts. On Thursday, the 7th of February, we'll be looking at grievances with Robert again. On Thursday, the 14th of February, we'll be exploring staff turnover, and we'll be looking at organisational culture on Thursday, the 21st of February. We look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for your time.